Good evening. How are you today? Oh, excellent. Thanks so much for joining us here at Arena Stage. My name is Seema Sueko. I serve as the Deputy Artistic Director here, and these civil dialogues are a great joy for us to be able to share with our community. How many of you have been to Arena Stage before? Oh, this is excellent. Now, how many of you have been to our civil dialogues before? A few of you. Since you've come to Arena Stage, you know that one of the things we really strive in all of our work that we do on our stages is to present a multiplicity of perspectives and to ignite informed dialogue. And so we do that with the work on our stages. And last year, Dr. Amitai Etzioni, to my left, approached us about doing dialogue outside of the work that we do on our stages, that we're living in a time of very complicated questions in our country, a very polarized time. And so he approached us with this question of, would it be possible to take some difficult topics, try to gather people who maybe hold different perspectives, and dialogue. So that's what we've strived to do over this past year with Dr. Etzioni as our leading us in this charge. What I always like to do at these civil dialogues is whet your dialogue maker. Dialogue has two parts to it. It's the speaking and the listening. So I encourage you to turn to somebody you don't know, someone you didn't travel here with, and just take about 30 seconds and share why you came to this dialogue today, and then swap. I'm hearing a lot of dialoguing and a lot of listening. That's great. Yay. So just one last thing that I'm going to say to you, which is if you have a cell phone or some other noisemaker, to take a moment to put it on silent for the duration of this event. And with that, I turn it over to Dr. Etzioni. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Seema. Actually, we're now almost completing our second year of collaboration, and it's been really very, very intellectually stimulating. You can find our previous sessions on YouTube and on the archives of the Arena Stage. And we had quite a variety, including the meeting which I most fondly remember, in which we had Trump supporters and Trump critics sitting on the stage and having a civil conversation. I consider this one of our high points. So we guarantee the civility of the dialogues by arranging trapdoors behind the chairs. It's a theater after all. Now, tonight, we are all agreed to move away from the headlines, and our subject tonight is not tariffs or trade wars, but a much larger canvas. And what are the basic relationships between the United States and China? What could they be? What should they be? And I'm not very far from a China expert. Actually, my main interest has been how the United States functions and how it relates to China. And I did a little book on it called Avoiding War with China. And that brings me really to our main starting point. So some historians discovered an iron law of history. And that law says that whenever there is a new rising major power and it confronts an established power, if the established power won't yield, a war will ensue. And that happened also history, they argue, beginning with Athens and Sparta. Then Graham Allison at Harvard did study 16 cases of such confrontation and found that in 25% no war ensued, but only in 75%. So you have here the pessimists say a war between the United States and China is inevitable. The optimists say it's only 75%. So, and indeed, there we hear, and I think you're going to hear some tonight, some very grave concerns about the way China conducts itself. Some of my colleagues hold that China has a very aggressive foreign policy, that it grabbed all those little islands, it turned them into military bases, put missiles on them, it puts investment and loans into many countries, but then uses those as economic leverage to force them the China foreign policy. They steal our intellectual property. They are conduct surveillance. A whole list of reasons for us to greatly worry about China. On the other hand, some of us feel that China is beleaguered by domestic problems. Because of its one-child policy, it has a rapidly aging population, that it has enormous tensions, that thousands of demonstrations every month all across China, enormous conflicts, that they lost legitimacy based on ideology. It's not based on affluence, but only about half the people have access to some kind of a middle class. The other, 500 million people still want it, and the challenge to provide that for them is enormous. Those who made it, so to speak, now want better health care, less pollution. So the pressure on the government to provide services is immense. As to their action overseas, some of my colleagues see China is going into ports from Haifa to Athens to prepare them for military expansions. Others see this in a much less troubling way. Let me just close this first point, and I have one more sentence because I'm very keen to listen. One thing we should take into account as we look at various parts of the world, that all those conflicts with China was involved in the last 20 years. Not a single shot was fired, not a single person was killed. So if you look at other parts of the world, you think that's something to be included in our picture. My absolutely favorite anecdote on this subject, for me sometimes the little stories are very telling. Last year, India was upset because China was building a road in a territory, not so India, so some territory north of India, and India objected to this Chinese expansion, intervention, whatever you want to call it. And it sent its troops to the border, and China sent its troops to the border. Now, you could imagine this being in Lebanon or some other place, what it's going to lead to. But what happened here, I'm not making this up, please, ladies and gentlemen. Everybody left their weapons behind, and they confronted each other with chest thumps. They're pushing each other this, but in order to avoid fistfights, everybody held their hands up high, and then they negotiated and settled the difference. Now, that's one possible way for solving international conflicts. My last point we need to discuss is, even assuming for a moment that China was not an aggressive foreign policy seeking to dominate the world, replace the United States, or even that it's willing to be satisfied with being a regional power with increasing influence in its region. There's a whole other question about human rights. And one can argue that it's our mission, our duty, even countries who are not aggressive, to use our leverage to make them attend to at least basic human rights. And if you take that position, you need to take one more step, please, and tell us how far you're willing to go in pushing human rights. One thing is to lecture China. The other thing is to sanction China, though if you do that, there are not many countries which will leave unsanctioned, or should we go beyond it? So that's my brief. And our tradition is not to introduce the speakers because you have details of their many achievements in your program, and it's just my time to listen. We're just going to go once down here, and sooner or later we invite you all to join the conversation. Please.
Thank you very much. Here you've got a panel of Chinese experts and me. I am not a China expert. I look at the future of warfare, and I look at the future of the economy, the way it's changing due to the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Of course, my background is a Marine infantryman and military historian, so obviously the Pentagon thought I'd be really good at the future. I see China as an aggressor. Now, that's not unusual for rising power. Rising power will naturally come out somewhat aggressive. And while I like Mike Pillsbury, I don't think they have a 100-year plan. I think with all the problems they got, they're not capable of a 100-year plan any more than we are. But Xi has stated that by 2049, he wants China to be the predominant power in Asia, a return of Hong Kong, and a return of Taiwan. Essentially, a return to the status of being the middle kingdom. Everybody out there kowtows to you. The foreign minister, Yang Jiechi, was a little blunter about it, and it's one of those moments where you kind of wonder, did I say that out loud? When at a conference he addressed the foreign leaders and said, China's a big country, and other countries are small countries, and that's just a fact. Now you can think that, and it's obviously a true fact, but probably not particularly diplomatic to say it. More recently, a rear admiral said, we see how frightened America is. If U.S. naval fleet dares to stop in Taiwan, it is time for the PLA to deploy troops to promote national security on the island. Another admiral stated, all we have to do is sink 2 U.S. carriers, and then we will own the Pacific. The most recent Chinese hack of the Australian Parliament and 3 political parties seems to be somewhat aggressive. They are not doing economic hacks, or this is not about intelligence hacks. This is about influencing Australia's politics. You mentioned the very aggressive actions in the South China Sea. Clearly, China wants hegemony in Asia now and uses its economic power to intimidate and bribe. The economic power to intimidate in the form of cutting off tourism to Taiwan when they did the egregious offense of electing their own leader, but not the one China wanted. The use of rare earth, withholding rare earth metals in trade disputes or more in political disputes. So I think China is stoking conflict. Internally, they have the century of humiliation is what's taught in their schools. The fact that isn't the West evil and didn't we hold China down for a long time? They completely missed the Taiping Rebellion when the little brother of Jesus Christ started a war that killed 20 million Chinese and almost led to the fall of the Qing Empire. They missed the boxers, the nationalists, the Great Leap Forward, the Red Guards. The people who have killed millions of Chinese in the last century have been primarily Chinese. That gets left out. Unfortunately, it's a little scary. They're moving from committee rule to one-man rule under Xi. And one-man dictatorships generally do not end well. Externally, this whole mercantilist approach to trade I talked about, and then the repression of their own population. The Uyghurs are one piece, the social credit score, I think you're familiar with that, how they're tracking everything you do, and they then assign you a social credit score, which affects where your kids get into school, what airplanes you can ride, what trains you can ride. The beauty of this is it leads to self-censorship. I don't want to visit this website. I'm not sure if it's illegal because they never tell you what's a bad website. But if I stay away from it, maybe my kids won't. Now, as far as why we won't fight, as much as I like Graham's work, the fact of the matter is the score is not 12 out of 16 times. The correct score is 0 out of 1. When a rising power and a ceded power confronted themselves, the U.S. and the USSR certainly should have fought. By every historical measure, we should have fought. We didn't. Why? Nuclear weapons. So the 0 starts, you got to start counting again with the appearance of massive nuclear weapons. So also there's deglobalization happening. We're seeing a shift from globalization to regionalization of trade, the return of manufacturing to home states, the return of services, our energy revolution, the revolution in renewable energy. All of these are returning to a regionalization. So that reduces the probability of conflict. One thing it is reducing is the American population's willingness to get involved overseas. So why might we fight? Probably it would be a clash of forces, an unintentional clash of forces to include our allies. So we have to be ready. It would be incredibly dumb to fight, but never ever underestimate the stupidity of people in large groups. So we have to be ready, but we can do it in an affordable way that is not provocative. If we build a strategy that's not based around needing to do a first strike, and a strategy that can ride out a first strike and still be viable. So that's where I'll leave it.
So the question that we're seized with this evening is China out to eat our lunch? Which I'm sure lends itself to some sort of culinary response. I'm sure the Chinese would not have wanted to eat my tuna fish sandwich today. But I think on the question, there's a fast-moving consensus, at least in this town, that the answer to the question is yes. So I was driving over here. I was listening to Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell on C-SPAN. And the one thing that the two of them agreed on was that the answer to this question posed this evening is yes. Both Schumer and McConnell separately were attacking China on one issue or another in their morning discussion on the floor of the Senate. I say it's a bipartisan consensus, and I'm going to quote two statements to you to give you a sense of this. This is from the Director of National Intelligence in a public report. China presents a persistent cyber espionage threat and growing attack threat to our core military and critical infrastructure systems. Then the Department of Defense and National Security Strategy issued last year. The central challenge to U.S. prosperity and security is the reemergence of long-term strategic competition by revisionist powers, meaning Russia and China. So in this administration, there was a move from a focus on fighting non-state actors, read terrorists, to a return to a great power competition focused most particularly on China and Russia. But it is a switch in strategy that began in the last administration, in the Obama administration, and has been intensified over the course of the last couple of years. We are, in effect, moving in rapid order from a relationship with our most important bilateral friend or enemy, depending on how you want to term it. We're moving from a relationship that was heavily cooperative to one that is now heavily competitive. Now, China has to assume some blame for this shift in the body politic in the United States. The business community, those of us who've been going into China over the last 2 or 3 or more decades, have witnessed a dramatic shift in the views of the business community towards China, from a reticence to criticize to a willingness to lay out the particulars about Chinese theft of intellectual property, the challenges of doing business on the ground in China. The NGO community has shifted dramatically over the last decade or more about the prospects for China becoming a more liberal country. The human rights community, of course, is up in arms over the treatment of 1 million or more Uyghurs, what is going on in Hong Kong today. And then, of course, as I've noted, the U.S. Defense community is firmly convinced that the primary adversary of the future is China. But I would argue that this is only part of the story. And we've been asked to take a strategic look at this issue, and so I would do it in the following way. So much of what troubles us today has little or nothing to do with China. The Chinese did not force us to spend 18 years on the ground in the Middle East. The Chinese did not force us to have a financial crisis in 2008, 2009, which almost drove us into a Great Depression. The Chinese did not force us to fail on a consistent basis to deal with our infrastructure, immigration, healthcare, education problems in this country. So for Democrats and Republicans alike, we find ourselves in a situation where it is difficult to have a reasonable conversation about a challenge that is real, but has boundaries to it. The Trump administration, and I hope I'll be excused for making a few specific comments here, is inflicting wounds on, unnecessary wounds on our alliance relationships in Asia. The Chinese welcomed his decision to walk away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. Our allies are aghast at his fixation with tariffs. And many question this continual lumping of China and Russia in one basket of adversaries. One of the great accomplishments of the Nixon opening to China was to separate these two potentially competitive powers. And one of the great failures of the contemporary period is to work assiduously at driving China and Russia together. The final point I want to make in these opening comments is to suggest that we have a collective danger ahead of us. I spent the last 2.5 days at a conference essentially focused on the arms control and national security challenges that the United States faces together with others. And the bottom line from this conference is that technology is moving so much faster than our collective ability to place boundaries and around that technology. Cyber is the most obvious example of where the incentive now is to develop offensive capabilities because defensive capabilities don't work anymore. But the Chinese and others have active anti-satellite programs. A number of countries, including China and the United States, are working at hypersonic weapons that can move at 5 times the speed of sound. many countries are working on artificial intelligence, machine learning. So we can imagine a day where we are handing off to machines the responsibility to alert a president on when he or she needs to respond to an incoming attack. So the environment in which this critically important bilateral relationship is unfolding, that environment has become measurably more challenging. And for us not to be having the type of strategic dialogue that Zhou Enlai and Henry Kissinger engaged in the 1970s about the mutual challenges ahead and the risk of all of us collectively going off the rails. The inability to have that dialogue poses a risk for all of us.
Well, Professor Yost opened with a joke about the title of this panel, about eating lunch, and I was going to make the same joke, so now I'm struggling for what to say. The issue of this question, is China going to eat our lunch? One can ask, well, would China want to eat our lunch? One can ask, what exactly is the lunch that we're talking about? And one can ask, what do we mean by China? And so let me start with that last one. I've come fairly recently to being in any kind of position like this where I dare to comment on broad questions of U.S.-China relations and so on. I've worked on the Xinjiang region and the Uyghurs mainly, and history in my past career. And what's brought me more into public comment on China has been the situation in Xinjiang, the concentration camps, and efforts to re-educate the ethnicity out of Muslim people there. So I've been very critical of Chinese policies in the last couple of years, and before that. But one thing that I'm trying to do as I do this is never to use the word China as a subject. So, China does this, China threatens that, right? And I mean no criticism to my colleagues, because it's very hard not to do this. But we, of course, all use it as a shorthand. But it's, let's just sort of break it down. We're talking about over 1.3 billion people, right? So what's that? I guess a fifth, almost between a fifth and a quarter of the population of the world, right? So when we talk about disengaging or decoupling or containing, we're talking about containing a quarter of the world's population, right? Who are not conveniently sitting at home in China anymore either, right? They're all around us, and they're students in our classes, and they're tourists in our city, and they're investors in our factories, and so on. So, we're kind of engaged whether we want to be engaged or not, like that, right? And then, so what are we really talking about? We're talking about the Chinese Communist Party, the party state of China. That's the subject of these sort of sentences. And more than that, because there's, I think, 90 million people in the Chinese Communist Party, we're talking about a narrow segment of the top tier of the Chinese Communist Party, and maybe even simply, the Central Committee and, the top leadership. So I'll say something about them in a minute. But first, all the rest, Chinese people, right? And obviously that's not a monolith either. But my own personal engagement with China goes back almost exactly 40 years. So now we're talking about 40 years since China embarked on its opening and reform. And I don't know how many of you have been to China yourselves, and if you've been there 40 years ago. But 40 years ago, the young people I tried to hang out with, I was a younger person myself then, it was difficult as an American college kid who'd just cut his ponytail off and was into the Grateful Dead to interact with Chinese peers, right? We had just different background, different interests, We went for walks in parks. We didn't go out drinking beer, and so on and so forth, right? And I look at my students now, and they show me their tattoos, my Chinese students, and they got ponytails, and they can tell me about, newest rap music, and, I'm the one who doesn't catch up with that, and on like this, right? And you can have conversations about, Sex in the City, which they saw the whole run on, their first exposure to pornography were soft-core scenes in American movies that they bought in pirated DVDs, right? So it just goes on. And so, Chinese people today are really global citizens. They're global consumers. That's, not so different from most of us, I think. And, not every Chinese person, but the couple hundred million who are now middle class and traveling the world, right? So it's really important to remember sort of who we're talking about. Back to the leadership of China, who we really mean when we say, China does this and China does that. It's worth thinking about, all right, what do they want? Do they want to challenge the US for world domination? Are they mainly concerned perhaps about preserving themselves and their own hold on power in China? And one of the interesting things about, when we get really worried about China and Chinese eating our lunch, one thing that's useful to remember is that what pretty much every elite in China wants to do is get their kids and their money out of China, right? Investing. They love China, and but it's very important to do both of those things because it's quite dangerous. It's particularly dangerous to be an elite business person, an elite politician, or political official in China. And the United States is one of the places they're very happy to get their money and their children to, right? So that's important to remember. And that China's expenditure on security, on domestic security, and maybe, I hope I'm still right about this, but their expenditure on domestic security is higher than their expenditure on global defense internationally, outward-facing defense, right? So they're very worried about the domestic situation, right? And so what do they do about this? Well, one of the ways they're trying to do to fix this is to puff up their own legitimacy through various kinds of means, through achievements. The tremendous economic growth of China over the past 40 years is very, very impressive. That rate, the rate of economic growth is going down. They're worried about economic slowdowns. There's big structural reasons for that as well. So they're concerned about that. They won't simply be able to ride on those economic achievements the same way anymore. They're worried about the demographic time bomb of the aging population. They're worried about inevitable unemployment, which is going to come from automation, which is happening in China just as it's happening everywhere else. And so they've been, and of course there isn't really much communism to the Chinese Communist Party anymore. They've replaced that with a kind of nationalism, right? And the nationalism works. Chinese people are very nationalistic, very patriotic. They're very happy to rise to great indignation if they see the United States, or particularly Japan, doing something they want to get angry about. One thing that's happened with this nationalism in particularly the last few years under the Xi Jinping regime, is that it has become more acerbic, and it's also become more of a narrow ethno-nationalism, not just a kind of national patriotism, but it's and perhaps somehow related to the nativist trend that's really sweeping the world. In this country, with white supremacy, in Modi's India, in many places, we're seeing this kind of really very nasty ethno-racial kind of nationalism. And so the definition of an ideal Chinese person that is being promoted through various kinds of ideological campaigns and in education and in media in China is increasingly becoming an idealized Han person. If you know the majority people of China, known as the Han. You speak Mandarin, that is Northern Chinese. You obey Han customs. And of course, you're unquestioningly loyal to the party. China had a very unique, I just did it, see? China had a very unique idea. Well, we'll say China. They actually had, we don't have time to sort of go into this, maybe in the question, I can do this later, but they actually had their own kind of top-down diversity system, which dealt with the many non-Han Chinese people. We call them minorities, and relative to the Han Chinese, who are 91% of the population, it seems like a small percentage, but there's still 130 million quote-unquote minorities in China, more than African Americans and Hispanics put together in this country, right? So it's a big number of people. This includes Uyghurs, Tibetans, Muslims of various kinds, and so on. So they had a nice way of dealing with that. They've been turning their back on that and running away from it as they double down on this kind of Han-focused, Han-centric nationalism. Now, one of the things this new this doubling down on sort of Han-centric nationalism and on a strong kind of acerbic nationalism does is it means that the party goes after the Uyghurs, goes after Tibetans, it goes after cultural difference very, very strongly. I think it also explains some of the reaction to Hong Kong as well, right? Territorial issues are particularly important to the Chinese Communist Party. They have a narrative of China's past, which they call the 100 Years of Shame. And much of that shame comes from losing, or actually almost losing and then regaining bits of Chinese territory through treaty ports, through Japanese occupation of the Northeast, and so on. So the Chinese Communist Party is setting itself up as the sort of icon of Chineseness and the savior who rescued China from its 100 years of shame and now is going to rejuvenate China to make China great again, right? It's very much that kind of an idea. And the way in which it's pursuing that and the way in which it's bolstering its legitimacy is through creation of internal enemies and these crackdowns on Uyghurs, on Tibetans, on Hong Kong, and saber rattling at Taiwan, which of course is another point of, another piece of territory which China says is ours, and we're going to get it back. So the Communist Party's legitimacy now, it's saying, is we're the ones who are going to get you back that, what was taken from you. And so this is a little different than saying China wants to take over the world. But I think particularly the Taiwan piece, and my colleagues here who really know security and U.S.-China relations better than I do, I'm curious what they would say, but I think the biggest danger is around Taiwan and the expansion in the South China Sea and even in the Indian Ocean are really, it looks like to me that China is planning to fight that war. So that raises a question then, obviously about U.S. support, kind of the ambiguous promised support for Taiwan, but also how should we respond to concentration camps in Tibet? How should we respond to the Chinese reaction to Hong Kong? Should we sort of hold back and say, well, you need to figure this out on your own? Or should we demonstrate strongly that we really care about those sorts of issues and that we care about the autonomy that the Communist Party has promised to these people under one country, two systems, under autonomous region kind of rules, and signal by caring about those things that we care about Taiwan too. And what frightens me is that with non-responses or ambiguous responses about Hong Kong, we're sending a signal to Xi Jinping that a grab for Taiwan might be possible at this point, and we wouldn't do anything about it.
Yeah, I guess I would agree that Taiwan is the single most dangerous point in all of this, and I think it's particularly dangerous now because of the way the Trump administration has left it ambiguous as to how they're going to respond. Prior to Trump, we have consistently had a leadership in this country which was committed to defend Taiwan if Taiwan was attacked without provocation by the mainland. And we have the Taiwan Relations Act that requires us to sell them arms that they might need. We even had a Secretary of State, Larry Eagleburger, once, who in a public talk at Annapolis declared that we had an obligation to defend Taiwan, period, which is not true. The 1979 Taiwan Relations Act does not commit us to the defense of Taiwan. And what we have always done with that is talked about strategic ambiguity. I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. I did have some funny reactions to things that my colleagues have said. I was amused by TX's reference to the Chinese meeting the Indians and bumping chests. And I think most of you are probably old enough, maybe not, to remember the 1969 Chinese-Soviet confrontations on their border. There was some shooting, but the incident that 69, yes.
It's a long time ago.
I'm sorry.
It was a long time ago.
Yes, but it was a long time ago. But the Chinese response was similar to what TX was referring to. The Chinese expressed their hostility towards the Soviet troops, held up pictures of Mao, to which the Soviets responded by dropping their pants and putting their butts in the direction of Mao. But that certainly was a lot better than shooting. And then Jim was referring to Chinese attitudes toward minority groups in their country. And I had a funny case of that, probably again a long time ago. This probably would have been about 81 or 82. We were down in Guangxi province with, I had a delegation with me, and the Chinese were entertaining us, and they brought in a group of minority dancers, and they put on a dance show for us, and then explained afterward that these minority people had more rhythm. I don't think you want to miss that one. I guess about a year ago at this time, I was writing the preface to the 6th edition of my History of U.S.-China Relations. And it occurred to me that the United States and China might end up in an armed conflict before I got around to writing the 7th edition. What troubled me about it were things that my colleagues have already mentioned. What's going on in the East China Sea, what's going on in the South China Sea, but again, particularly the threats toward Taiwan and how the Chinese don't really understand what it is that the current administration is doing on those grounds. Now, the problem with this is also involves Xi Jinping, the current Chinese leader, who seems more, or less rather, risk-averse than his predecessors. And that I find kind of scary when we have such an incompetent administration of our own. And the signaling back and forth can be terribly confusing and I think very dangerous. Now, the point I would continue with is that I want to make it clear that China is not a friendly country. We've talked about the rise of Chinese nationalism. A good part of that is anti-Americanism. And they've had great success stimulating anti-Americanism in the country. And you've probably noticed in this recent problems with the protests in Hong Kong, how the Chinese government has declared that the black hand of the United States is behind these protests. That always they're teaching their people that the United States is an enemy. And that I don't perceive as a friendly country. Now, some of that, of course, is ideological. I don't think we can ever trust a country that mistreats its own people. But their anti-imperialism strikes at us. It's not, we don't have the same problems we had years ago with Mao and our own concerns about Chinese communism or communism spreading all over the world. It's much more, much simpler than that. And again, I think it's the Chinese who are creating a problem there. So what kind of a relationship do we have? I think George Bush and Condi Rice were probably on target in 2000 when they talked about strategic competitors. And that's where we are. The two countries are going to compete, and which in of itself is not a terrible thing, but concerned about whether or not the United States will know how to handle this. And I think there's no question but that in the confrontation with a rising China, the United States is going to have to give some ground. The unipolar moment has long since passed. So we have to see something along those lines. Now again, Amitai's question about is China going to eat our lunch? And however you construe our lunch, and it's probably more than tuna fish sandwiches, I think there's no doubt that the Chinese, as a rising power, and as rising powers have done historically, are going to push the limits. And if we lay that lunch out on the table for them and don't do anything to protect it, why shouldn't they grab it? That's the way it works. They're going to push as hard as they can, whenever they can, and we will have to decide where we want to draw the lines. Now, we've talked also about the spread of Chinese influence in the world. The ports that they're building around the world, ports that they've taken over, the Confucius Institutes, the hundreds of Confucius Institutes, maybe thousands by now, all over the world. So yes, they are extending their influence, and they should be, and there's no reason for us to be concerned about it unless we stop attempting to extend our influence. If we cut back on foreign aid, if we abandon our allies, if we cut back funding for cultural diplomacy, then there's no limit to where the Chinese can go. But if you ask around the world, if when we're showing our right side, we'll not talk about when that last was, but people would almost always prefer our system and what we have to offer to what the Chinese have to offer. That's not true of all the dictators around the world who like Chinese money that comes without strings, without concern for human rights issues or corruption or things like that. So yes, I think the Chinese will push as hard as they can to get what they can from us, and at some point, we have to show our determination to stop them. That doesn't necessarily require a war. Now, Amitai was very kind to send me a copy of his recent book, Avoiding War with China. And in it, I think you all should take a look at it if you're interested in this subject. He makes a considerable number of persuasive arguments for concessions the United States can make toward China with minimal pain for the United States. He points to places where we could have cooperated with the Chinese, for example, on the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which is probably the most constructive thing the Chinese have offered to the world in this century. And instead, the Obama administration opposed it, tried to keep our friends and allies from getting involved in it. I think that was a mistake, and I think Amitai does a really nice job with that in his book. Now, the problem with that is, to the best of my knowledge, there is no Chinese equivalent of that book. Nobody is arguing about what concessions the Chinese might make to avoid war with the United States. Now, I have Chinese friends who could write those books if they were allowed to. A couple of them have openly said that maybe Chinese leaders should consider that some of the hostile responses they're getting from the United States were provoked by things that the Chinese did. And that's worth keeping in mind. But they're not writing those books. There is no dialogue in China about how to avoid war with the United States or whether the United States is being fair with a rising China. And there's not going to be. And I think that's something we have to be concerned about. The concessions can't all come from our side. and the willingness to make concessions has to be granted by the other side as well. Now, having said that, and being probably even more hawkish than TX on that, I would say, obviously we have to continue to engage with the Chinese politically and economically. There's no going back from that. We have to be able to talk to them about the issues that divide us, about the issues where we might have shared interests, where we might be able to work together. Economically, the idea of decoupling is absurd. Our countries are so closely tied, and it would be a terrible mistake, a disaster for the world economy, and not so good for our own. I don't know if any of you read the Washington Post here, but last week there was a funny column by Adam Schiff and somebody else talking about the extent to which the elements that go into our generic drugs in this country come from China, an enormous percentage of those. And I was particularly struck when he referred to pills for high blood pressure and for cholesterol, both of which I have in my pocket at this time. And that seems to be just one of the smaller examples of what a disaster it would be to try to break that off. So, where do we go from here? What can I add to what my colleagues have already said? I think the key problem, and friends in the State Department and the National Security Council and ODNI have been telling me for 20-odd years that how hamstrung they are by our dysfunctional government. And I think we would all concede it's worse now than it's been for that any of us have ever experienced. And we've got to get that straightened out. Again, it comes back to a point that's already made, that the real problems are not in China, but in the United States, that we are screwing ourselves, if I may put it bluntly. I think we have to revitalize the State Department. That would be where I would start as a diplomatic historian. We have to get back to work with our allies, many of whom have lost faith in our ability to assist them and to do what's needed, and justly so. We have to get back to giving aid to developing countries. We have to get back to working hard on our soft power and cultural diplomacy. These are things we have to do. Most of us here lived through the Cold War. We don't need another one of those. And we certainly don't need a hot war.
Professor Warren, can we?
My last sentence. We don't need a hot war because I've outgrown my Navy uniform and I'm not ready for anything like that.
Well, first of all, thank you all for a very excellent startup and stimulating discussion. I'm going to take a very short round to give you all a chance to answer very quickly the following questions. I don't think we heard yet the dovish position, so I think I'd like to give it voice. A lot of was mentioned about how much China is threatening Taiwan. Nothing happened to Taiwan. China has been talking for decades and decades and decades how terribly important it is to them that this is part of their country and they will not allow and they will say, no shot was fired, Taiwan is going its own way, develop a democratic government, trading with China. Reference was made to what China is doing in Hong Kong. Nothing. They put troops exercising on the border to make a threat. We talk often about the Pentagon like to point to those islands that have been militarized. But if you talk to our generals privately, they say these are sitting ducks. These are like maroon aircraft carriers. We have one missile aimed at each one of those islands, and ever shooting where they disappear in 5 minutes. We push very hard on India to arm itself against an attack from China. Why on earth would China want to attack India? What would it do if it won? Can you imagine China having to run India? We keep pushing Japan to change the constitution to arm itself. Why would China want to attack Japan? Now, it's true that they feel that we are ringing around them with military bases. We armed Vietnam. We put pressure on all the countries on their border to arm themselves. They would like to have secure borders. They would like to increase their influence on Cambodia and Laos, on country around them. But beyond that, there's very little hard evidence. Yes, there's some very excellent quotes. My friend Hamas quoted, "Believe me, if you're Chinese, you can find plenty of American quotes to parallel those." So if you go to the RAND Corporation, and that's more than quotes, these are strategic position papers, talk about 4 different ways of attacking China: a long nuclear war, a short nuclear war, an intermediate nuclear war. My book starts with a position paper financed by the Pentagon, which says that the war with China should start with an attack on the mainland, not like some more moderate people suggest a blockade. Imagine how that reads to the Chinese. So my last, given all the domestic pressures they have, in effect, if you talk to them privately, they scoff at the fact that some other countries like the United States are willing to spend billions in blood on organizing the world. They want to see that they attend to the most urgent needs of their own people. As to the Silk Road, we keep threatening to block their sea lanes. So they're trying to find other roads, land-based roads, to secure the raw material and energy without which they cannot survive. So my one question to each one of you is to be, can you quickly answer the Dove position? Second and last, you talked about human rights, but I didn't hear any of you speaking clearly how far you're willing to go in terms of pushing human rights. Are you willing to lecture China? Are you willing to sanction China? Are you willing to shoot China until they become American-style liberal democracy? So in order to leave time for the audience to participate, let's have a quick short round, please.
Your first point, they haven't done anything to Taiwan because they couldn't. They literally could not get across the 100 miles of water. What they've done since 1996 is build a Navy that can do that. They're building at a cycle on amphibious ships, on short-range ballistic missiles, on medium-range ballistic missiles, and on attack aircraft. That means that within a few years, they can do this if they choose to. And they have completely reorganized their command, and one of their command's sole function is to prepare to invade Taiwan. That is not a defensive maneuver. I agree there's no reason to attack India. The incident on the border was brilliant on the Chinese part. They built a road which put them in position. The Indian response was not bumping chests. That was the platoon level response. The national level response is India has invested tens of millions of dollars in building airfields, logistics chains, and is building an armored corps, or excuse me, a mountain corps to fight there. The beauty for China is that takes the money away from the Indian Navy, which is the real threat to China. The One Road, the BRI, is not an attempt to replace a logistics chain. To give you an idea of what it would require on trains to move the same amount of freight that goes through a single Chinese port, the busiest port, is 1,000 trains a day, each way of 200 cars or more, counting on the Kazakh and the Russian railway system. This is not a viable option. Again, China, and when I say China, I mean the leadership, because I grew up in not a particularly large family. There were 7 of us. There was one opinion. It wasn't like there's the Hamas family, we get together and have a vote on what we're going to do. Dad said we're going to do, and that's what we did. So when you're talking about the Hamas family on certain decisions, you're talking about the decision Dad made. And I think we have to say that for most security issues in China. As far as the minor response in the river war, it was a corps level fight. They exchanged thousands of rounds of artillery, perhaps tens of thousands. Hundreds of people were killed, and Mao backed it down by dropping a test bomb on his nuclear range. So maybe the actual correct count on Graham is 0 and 2 because they didn't fight.
When was that
the 69 River War. He dropped a nuclear bomb. So maybe the correct response, China and Russia should have fought then. China and the Soviet Union. They didn't, nuclear weapons. So correct response is 0 and 2.
So, a couple of days ago, oil facilities in Saudi Arabia were hit. The Chinese didn't do it, right? The technology that was used was not sophisticated. It was off the shelf. And yet, a major part of Saudi production was at least down for a bit. The Houthis in Yemen said that this was only the beginning of the threat to that oil production. So why do I begin my answer to your question with that example? First of all, much of that production goes to Asia. Over 60% of the energy going through the Strait of Hormuz now goes to Asia, much of it to China. So at one level, the Chinese and the United States have an interest in the security of the Gulf, and we ought to be talking about that mutual interest. But the other reason I give that example is that relatively unsophisticated technology, unsophisticated in modern terms, took out a portion of Saudi Arabia's production capacity. At present, the Chinese are developing the capability, and we can argue about whether we're talking about now, next year, 5 years from now, to take out every carrier battle group that we have in East Asia, every base that we have in Asia, and do it in a way that we cannot defend against. And so as we look as strategists, as we look to the future, we need to look at a future where no fixed facility of the United States is safe and no floating facility of the United States is safe from prompt attack. And that's the future we have to plan for. I'm going to make one other point, I hope to reinforce the point. I do a mind game with my students. And in the mind game, I imagine them sitting around a table in early 1914. And I asked them, if you were sitting around a table in early 1914, would you imagine a world war that would destroy regimes and lead to the establishment of the Soviet Union and a future that was more dangerous than anything imaginable before that? And so that sort of mind game with the technology that we're now developing, we broadly, I think would be my response to your good question.
Two of you, please briefly.
So I'll just talk about the second question, was what do we do about human rights? And so this is why I distinguish between the Chinese people more broadly and the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party. It used to be when we were worried, we would say, well, should we trade with China or should we sanction China over human rights? Right? Those days of sort of Carter era concerns and approaches, they're gone, right? Right now, we're in effect sanctioning China through the tariffs for other reasons completely unrelated to human rights, and the administration seldom talks about human rights, and certainly not linked it to the tariffs. But we have tools which can be much sharper, more precise tools to focus in on the leadership themselves. And this is why I mentioned their money and their kids. Obviously, I'm not targeting their kids, but maybe their kids' admissions to Harvard or something like that. Unless they're legacies, and then, of course, we'll let them all in. But or if they row, right? So but Xi Jinping's daughter is a Harvard legacy, so we're going to have lots of Xis up there. Anyway, no, but seriously, and offshore accounts, right? So this is the way that we went after ISIS. This is the way we go after gangs. And the 1989 student leader Wu Kaishi, I had a beer with him in Taiwan over the summer. And he was saying, the Communist Party, they're a mafia. You have to treat them like a mafia. Go after their money. And actually, that's a fairly smart thing to do. And we have a law that allows us to do it called the Global Magnitsky Law, which allows us to single out individual officials who are responsible for implementing horrendous policies. And some of this is symbolic, right?
It's well taken.
Yes.
Point well taken.
Okay, so point's done. That's my point. We should do it.
Quickly, if you want the arguments for avoiding war and concessions the United States should make, read Amitai's book. On the other hand, if you want a different case, TX mentioned Mike Pillsbury's book, which is called The 100-Year Marathon, I think, in which he shows how the Chinese have been planning for a long time in 100 years to take over the world. I agree with TX, that's nonsense. But on the other hand, Mike, however devious he often may be, and however much many of us are uncomfortable supporting him, reads Chinese marvelously. He's been very close for 20, 30, 40 years to the Chinese military. He's read everything they put out, and he knows, and I think can demonstrate to your satisfaction, even maybe to Amitai's satisfaction, that the Chinese military is determined to drive the United States out of Asia and ultimately, perhaps in 100 years, maybe 200 years, to take over the world. Right now, they settle just for the Western Pacific, but that's going to grow and the mission creep will just continue.
I'm going to turn it over to you in 1 minute. I don't want you to take you back to 1914, but I'll take you back to 1947, after which for 45 years we heard very similar stories about the Soviet Union, and we mobilized and we spent billions and we fought wars in Vietnam and in Afghanistan, only to learn that basically they collapsed under their own weight. True, we put pressure on them and so on and so on, but we vastly exaggerated their strength. It's a very similar story we're hearing today. Now, just to give a variety of viewpoints, one last line, since several times my concessions to China were mentioned, I must tell you, if you read the book, you see that I suggested that each concession will have to be met by a counter-concession before we make the next one. This is your opportunity now to challenge the panel, ask questions, such. Please use the microphone here.
I must confess I'm a dilettante, but an avid reader of foreign affairs. And my question is probably not answerable. But there's, as we all know, phenomenal intelligence in this room and in this city and in this country, experience and just phenomenal ability to look at problems and discuss them and address them. How on earth do we get the appropriate people in Congress to bring the appropriate pressure on the appropriate person to listen to the experts and not go with just his gut? And I think it's a really crucial question because heaven knows where we're going to go with all this.
Let's take one more question, please.
Can I answer that one first?
We get all of them answered. Just 1 minute, just 1 minute.
30 seconds.
was surprised that none of the panelists addressed your question on whether or not they're willing to make any concession for human rights for this 1/4 of the world's population. Does the United States only care about human rights when it's dealing with a small country, and yet when it's dealing with a big power, have we given up on human rights in China? And that's what because I hear nothing, I think that's the answer.
Please.
I'll take the first one. Okay, the
So
first
quick-
one, the problem is it's a wicked problem. And the fundamental definition of wicked problem or interactively complex problem is the experts will disagree. Whatever expert you bring me to show that China is a horrible country, I'll bring you an expert who will show you it's not. And that's the fundamental problem of getting the right person to make the decision. Wicked problems have no solution. You only manage them.
Yeah, I've been going for years to the Council on Foreign Relations, to CSIS, to Brookings, to the American Enterprise Institute, and I hear all of these brilliant analyses, and every problem that we face, these people can solve for us. The problem is nobody's listening, and certainly not at the top. Even if we got the Congress involved, we currently have an administration that would ignore the Congress. So we've got some serious problems here, and then our world isn't going to change until that part changes.
We had a question about human rights.
Yeah, so I mean, I have been talking about it. So the religious aspect of it and the idea of religious freedom is actually kind of structurally built into some of the things that U.S. government does. We have scheduled forums about that and reports that are instructed to look into those issues. We've heard from Vice President Pence about religious freedom. We've heard from Secretary of State Pompeo about religious freedom in China. To their credit, they've focused on the Uyghurs. So Muslims as well as Christians are of concern from this section. Senator Rubio has been really a leader in bringing up the Uyghur issue, again and again. And in fact, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, which I was referring to, is using Global Magnitsky. He's been pushing for that. So we are, seeing some of that, not obviously from the top, and we haven't yet had these bills passed through Congress. There is concern. I think the issue is, though, from at least those most prominent people speaking about religious rights in China, they are coming, from my point of view, from a very hawkish place that is also willing to dismiss China wholesale, right? To kind of throw the whole baby out with the bathwater as well, and seeing this as not issues that can be dealt with in a targeted way of persuasion that comes with respect for aspects of China's tradition, while at the same time saying, hey, you guys are better than this, you are a diverse society, treat them properly. So that's where I would hope that a new administration would both give respect while at the same time trying to explain how China's own tradition can manage. You can have Muslims and Christians and you can have diversity in China. It's not going to challenge the Chinese culture.
Let me just add one thing. When we talk about human rights, it's basically a profound moral issue. The problem is that we are obviously, manifestly, completely hypocritical. And so we like to lecture China and Russia, but more people are beheaded in Saudi Arabia every year than beheaded by ISIS in all those years. When we now deal with North Korea, human rights are not even mentioned. So in order to have a moral position, you have to have an elementary consistency. And we obviously have not been doing that. It's not only last year or this administration. We've been playing with the generals in Latin America and so on, so on, so on. So I think we should promote human rights, but we should start by being clear that we not play favors with those with whom we have some kind of interest.
Can I add just one thing? Thank you. Clap. Amitai, can I very quickly add to that? Quickly, yeah. So I was thinking about this problem in an op-ed I wrote over the summer, and one of the problems for the U.S. now, because of this hypocrisy, is to go forward, after 2020 even, and say, okay, well, we're back to promoting the American way of life again. Just forget about the last, right? That's not going to work. And so, how do you make this values? How can we restore American values as part of our as part of our foreign policy, without just looking very hypocritical? And I think you have to take it up to another level. I use the word human values. That might not be the best term, but try and deparochialize democracy. It's not just something that we have. Try to explain how this is, it's a global creation. Our best values, our best practices, our rights are a global product. And at the same time, so moving things to this other kind of supranational level allows us to talk about climate change, which is something we haven't mentioned yet here, but this is an overwhelming issue. China may retake Taiwan, but if it's being destroyed by typhoons, they may wish they hadn't, right? So, I mean, this is the bigger issue around which we can all potentially gather. So, we could use climate change as an issue to work together with China and use human values as a rallying cry with our European allies, which will give us some cover for our own failings on the southern border and elsewhere.
The problem is we're hypocritical. We can't be talking about climate change and driving SUVs. We can't be talking about concentration camps starting our own. We can't be talking about religious freedom when we try to impose Christian values on our society. So, I mean, the national security affair, I don't see we can make that work. And I don't think it can be central to our foreign policy.
I can't resist it. One more sentence. One sentence. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights covers political, legal rights and socio-economic rights. We choose one half of it. The other half we leave to the others. Again, if you want to go supra, read the whole goddamn thing.
Hello. Thank you very much for these dialogues.
Can you lower the microphone so it reaches you? I like to hear what you have to say.
Yes. Thank you very much. First of all, I should start off by saying my choice is to live in a democracy rather than a communist country. Definitely. I feel that I have a bit more chance to be myself and get what I want in life that way. But since I've come from an ex-colonial countries, I know that Europeans and America have a negative view of the other. They really see them as inferior. So I think you look at China, to a certain extent, you don't realize that they have the same pride that you have. And they feel they have a history. They remember when you came in and used guns to impose your wants on them. You gave them the opium. And it is natural for human nature not to want to be the subservient country, especially when you know that might is right. Okay? That doesn't mean to say that they want to bomb you. They just want to know that they can hold their own. I think that that is it. I may be wrong. It's just my point of view. But I do feel that China has treated certain countries better than the colonialists treated other countries where they totally dominated them. They're going into Africa, yes, because they want something, but they are doing things to help Africa along. Also, I feel that America has to look at China as the person said, frenemies, because of course their best bet to bring up what is happening in this country now is a good trade. They threw away the other agreement that Obama had made, but they do need to get in on China. And I'm not saying that China hasn't done.
We need to have a chance for.
Oh, I'm
some of the-
sorry.
No, but thank you very much. They're very helpful and interesting observations.
I realize the panel is designed to look ahead maybe 100 years, as we argued that the Chinese may or may not be doing. My question is, if tariffs, and this is more near term, if tariffs are not doing the work or not likely to do the work, does anyone on the panel have a suggestion on how we should influence or get the Chinese to loosen up on intellectual property, on American firms, and so forth,
Good question.
including trade?
Good question.
What? Warren suggests we give them Taiwan. So I would answer your question this way, that there really are two approaches, broad approaches to dealing with China on any number of issues. One is to do it solo, which is what this administration has decided to do. So these are tariffs imposed by the United States on China. He has his own set of tariffs that he wants to impose on others, including our allies, sometimes under the heading of national security, which the Canadians take some umbrage to. But the other approach is to work collectively with others to achieve the ends that we feel will serve our interests. I mentioned in passing the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which would have had us working with countries, including Japan, from both sides of the Pacific to achieve common economic goals. When the president early in his administration said that we would not join TPP, the other members went ahead and formed their own organization, absent the United States. But that would have been a logical response to some of the positions that China has adopted in the economic and trade realm, and might well have put them on pressure to adopt changes that we would find to be in our general interest. So, bottom line, work with others. Don't do it solo.
That's the path we should take, but inevitably the changing technology is returning manufacturing to markets, services to markets, economies are becoming regionalized. So this is taking care of itself. Long before the tariffs, the global supply chains are reorganizing themselves. So that's all in our favor. We are wonderfully situated to maximum benefit from that. The lady's question on China just wants to defend itself. I would believe that if they weren't building so dang many long-range weapon systems that are specifically designed to reach way outside of necessary ranges and destroy things.
Hi, I'm intrigued about an issue that has not come up at all in this discussion. Number one is the Chinese hold about $3 trillion or $2 trillion worth of Chinese debt, number one. Number two is Xi Jinping is American educated. Number three is the Chinese issue about 800,000 visitor visas. The United States issues about 800,000 visas to Chinese visitors who come to the United States. And we have educated about, I would say, there are about 60 or 50,000 Chinese graduate students in the United States at any one time. I think the numbers are roughly correct. And so to what degree, and this has been going on now for ever since when Xi Jinping asked, when actually Deng Xiaoping asked one of our American scholars that we should be issuing visas to that we should be issuing Chinese students. And Deng Xiaoping said, "How many do you want?" So the question here is, to what degree the Chinese know our game better than we know theirs? Because there's so much American, so many American ideas actually have spread in China.
Okay.
All right,
I'll take that. The idea that change will come from below is pretty much historically inaccurate. It's led by an elite, and the elite is not interested in that change. Yes, they're U.S. educated. Yes, the French, the Germans, and the British interacted continually. The royal families were all related, and they decided, oh, the hell with it. Let's fight each other anyhow. So that's one of the problems with history is that, again, stupidity in large groups. So I think the Chinese are doing what they're doing, and it's not a bad, it's actually a pretty good approach. But I don't see any long-term change in China as long as the Communist Party's on top. They're desperately afraid of giving up because one of the problems is there's no one to replace them. And when the empire collapses, when the mandate of heaven passes, they have civil wars, and they have big civil wars. The Taiping Rebellion killed 20 million people with bladed weapons. That takes some effort.
A couple of years ago, an unnamed agency in our government invited me and my wife in for a session to discuss what would happen if the Chinese Communist Party collapsed. And it didn't take very long. I think everybody's paper decided it would be an absolute disaster.
Let me talk about the educational side, or the university side, a little bit. I'm not quite sure exactly what the thrust of the gentleman's question was, whether he approved or disapproved of us training so many Chinese graduate students. It used to be that Chinese graduate students stayed in the US, or did their damned well best to do so. And many of them still want to do that. It's actually harder now because of restrictions on whatever kind of H-1 visas and green cards and the whole thing. But I think everyone needs to, when it comes to fears about Chinese scholars and Chinese students, we all need to kind of take a deep breath and step back and think about who we're talking about, how many of them are actually in these really secure, military-related kind of tech fields, how many of them are studying history, and so on. And also, don't expect them to go back being super America fans, necessarily. But the recognition and the knowledge and just interactions and connections and having a bunch of American Facebook friends along with your other Facebook friends, all of that is part of it, right? These are global networks, and young people are completely enmeshed in global, networks now, right? So, and then finally, I think, no one would say, well, let's stop selling GM cars to China, right? We tend to worry a lot about our education. But this is an American product.
Okay, we
right?
need to close.
Yes. So it's a very effective and successful American industry, and it's odd that people want to shut it down.
Well, before I ask you all to thank the panel for a very rich and nuanced discussion, I'd like to invite you all to our next dialogue, which is going to be on nationalism and the question it raises, as you see all over the world. Nationalism and populism are rising and threatening democracy. Democracy, that's going to be on our next subject. I very much hope to see you here. Now, would you kindly help me and thank the panel for taking the evening and joining us.